Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX. Well, let's take a look at some of the top stories. U.S. presidential envoy Steve Witkoff will lead a delegation to Egypt to join Gaza ceasefire and hostage talks, according to Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Abdelati, as Qatar's Prime Minister and Turkish delegates will also participate in the third day of negotiations on the indirect talks between Hamas and Israeli representatives. Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg has claimed that she was kidnapped and tortured by Israeli forces after being detained with 478 others from the global Smooth Flotilla, which attempted to deliver aid to Gaza, according to statements made at a press conference. Meanwhile, according to UN reports, Israeli shelling in Gaza continues despite U.S. calls for pause during ongoing ceasefire negotiations in Qatar. Russian President Vladimir Putin has claimed on his 73rd birthday that Russian forces have captured nearly 5,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory in 2025, while a top Russian commander said troops are advancing in all directions. However, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has dismissed the claims and pointed to gains in Donetsk instead. A Ukrainian drone strike has caused a temporary blackout in Russian-occupied parts of the Zaporizhzhia region, but power has been fully restored now, according to Russian-installed Governor Yevgeny Balitsky in a separate statement. Kherson's Russian-appointed Governor Vladimir Saldo has said about 38,000 people in his region were also without electricity, though no direct link to the Zaporizhzhia outrage was specified. U.S. President Donald Trump's threat to invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy military forces in Democratic-led cities has escalated tensions, with Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker accusing him of using troops as a political weapon. Legal battles have emerged over National Guard deployments, and a federal judge temporarily blocked the troop presence. Ecuadorian President Daniel Noboa has survived an apparent gun and stone attack on his motorcade while opening a water treatment plant in central Ecuador, as reported by his environmental minister Ines Manzano, who has confirmed bullet marks on his vehicle. The assault involved a crowd of around 500 protesters amid escalating unrest over diesel price hikes. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has stated that the UK will not pursue a visa deal with India during his two-day visit to India starting today, focusing instead on maximizing the new free trade agreement signed in July and set to take effect next year, according to media reports. Taiwan has reappointed former Economy Minister Lin Hsini as its envoy to this year's APEC summit in South Korea, marking his second consecutive year representing Taiwan in the key international forum. Lin, who also led Taiwan's delegation in 2005, will attend under the name Chinese Taipei due to China's political objections. Now we stay from this news coming in from Malaysia. Malaysia has demanded the release of its nationals after Israel intercepted a flotilla heading to Gaza. Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has strongly condemned the Israeli military and called for the immediate freedom of Malaysian activists involved in the mission. Meanwhile, Swedish activist Greta Thunberg claimed that she and other detainees were tortured in Israeli custody. Speaking in Stockholm, she has said that they were kidnapped and denied clean water, while some lacked medication. Israel denies mistreating detainees and called the flotilla a publicity stunt supporting Hamas. Thunberg and 478 other participants were reported on Monday. Now for this discussion, we're joined by Professor Vaseline Popovsky. He's a professor and vice dean at Jindal Global Law School. Joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us again. Good to see you. Now, so far about this flotilla, going back to their mission, of what do we know, what have they achieved and what they have not and what they could not achieve and what were their goals?
There are two missions, one by Greta Thunberg, as you mentioned, but also another one called Freedom Flotilla. Well, it indicates that all around the world, organizations, mostly humanitarian organizations, aid delivery, food delivery organizations, are worried about the pictures from Gaza and the starvation of the population there. And they engage in those activist deliveries. Obviously, they want to show some sympathy with the starving population. And when Israel reacts to that and says that this is some sort of publicity, it's not really correct. However, on the other hand, I will also say it's not correct what Greta Thunberg is saying, that she was tortured in detention. Yes, they were provided with basic food and water and sanitation, but obviously nobody will deny them food and water in detention. So both sides were using a little bit of aggravated language. Israel saying that these are publicity stints, which are not just that, because people are worried about the starving population of Gaza, but also claims that Israeli military tortured some of the detainees is also aggravated. Obviously, the Malaysian Prime Minister and Foreign Ministry is correct to demand the release as soon as possible of everybody who is detained. And most of the people, as I understood from the last hour, were released. So there is, again, not much problem there. Those should be released. They should go back to their homes.
Professor, from what we know, why are they still being held in Israel, such as the Malaysian people who were in this flotilla?
Yes, I understand that they will be deported. I meant the previous flotilla, the one which Greta Thunberg initiated. Those people were released. Everybody's back home, including Greta Thunberg. She's speaking from Stockholm. The next one just happened yesterday, and for that matter, there are needs to basically organize that deportation, simply paperwork, flights, air assistance, and everything else. But obviously, Israel doesn't want to keep those people. They will release them as soon as the paperwork and the airplanes are ready to take them back home. There is no point to keep them anymore there. So it's simply a bureaucracy, I guess, in terms of small delay in deportation of every activist there.
And going back to Greta Thunberg, how might her claims of torture and mistreatment in Israeli custody impact global perception of Israel's treatment of detainees, even the detainees who are not Palestinians and who are politically charged situations involving Gaza and Hamas?
Well, that's a good question, because we can somehow see that what Greta Thunberg is not so much about herself, how she was mistreated, rather than by pointing that a lot of Palestinians in custody in Israel for many years, some of them being detained for many years. And that really is illegal, that does amount to violations of human rights. People without charges should not be detained unless there is a proper judicial process and some charges are raised and judges are confirming those charges and issuing sentences. But simply detaining people for longer than a day or two is already unacceptable, and on that I think the message from those detentions is that Israel should do better, let's put it this way, in quickly deciding each case individually. If necessary to detain longer, they need to have a judge approval for that. But the judicial process needs to be very much followed strictly and scrupulously so that there are no violations of human rights whatsoever. And the violations are about illegal detentions and about unfair trial, and often these are raised by many. And again, the excuse usually Israel says is that we are in emergency, we are in a war situation. Moreover, with the anniversary, the second anniversary of the 7 October attack yesterday, it's also kind of part of the whole picture of accusations both sides. On one hand, Israel accuses the entire world of not being enough sympathetic to the situation of the hostages. On the other hand, its own treatment of Palestinians is similarly brutal.
Yes, with that, I would like to thank Professor Popovsky for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now we move on. The Russian Foreign Ministry is condemning the European Commission's latest proposal to use frozen Russian assets as collateral for loans for Ukraine, calling it a blatant attempt to steal what rightfully belongs to Russia. In a statement, Dmitry Birichevsky, director of the Ministry's Department of Economic Cooperation, has warned that Moscow is prepared to respond, urging Brussels to reconsider what he called ill-considered actions. This follows European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's announcements, where she clarified that while the EU would not confiscate the assets valued at over 200 billion euros, those funds could support a so-called reparations loan to aid Ukraine. Russia has sharply opposed any use of its sovereign reserves, with President Vladimir Putin warning of deep consequences for the global economic order and the Kremlin vowing legal retaliation. Now for this discussion, we go back to Professor Vasilin Popovsky. He's a professor and vice dean at Jindal Global Law School. Thank you very much, Professor, for staying with us. Now, what will be the repercussions if they were to use these funds to get loans to Ukraine?
I don't see. It's usually everything coming out of Kremlin is kind of empty talk. It's either a lie or some sort of manipulation. And in this sense, the sanctions on Russia, on Russian individuals, not on the Russia as general, but specific individuals and companies were sanctioned back after the invasion of Crimea 11 years ago. And correctly so, because those were individuals and companies that benefited from the annexation of Crimea, so that every military or some individuals or bank or company that was connected and benefited from illegal occupation of Crimea was under sanctions. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. And the European Commission also mentions that these assets will be part of reparations one day. They are not frozen forever, and they will be used for the kind of deducted from the reparations that Russia will need to pay for all the destructions and loss of life and children in Ukraine. So it will be a huge bill, by the way. Once it is finished and it is calculated, Russia will need to pay much more than those 200 billion frozen in assets. So all the statements by the Russian foreign ministers are absolute nonsense. And it will be legal. There will be a legal ceasefire, legal peace agreement, like it was done after the First World War and the Second World War, and the reparations that were paid by the countries like Germany at the time, and so on. So there is nothing to listen. I don't even want to comment, even less to listen what the foreign ministry in Russia is saying on that. And for that matter, yes, everything will be properly done. And repercussion, again, Russia always mentions some sort of retaliation, but we simply don't see any capability of Russia to do any retaliation. They are basically doing very little on the battlefield as well. You mentioned earlier, you quoted Vladimir Putin on his birthday saying 5,000 kilometers, but the front line is 1,000 kilometers. He simply doesn't understand that what he said actually means 1 kilometer per the battlefield itself, which is basically nothing for 1 year. You know, the slowest animal on earth is a snail, and a snail will walk faster than the Russian army. It's really ridiculous, those statements. And somehow, again, to continue this ridicule, you know, that if a snail moved from Bryansk in February 2022, that snail would have reached Berlin by now. So this is the speed of the Russian advance. A snail, the slowest animal in the world, will walk faster than the Russian army into Ukraine. So again, there are plenty of jokes and anecdotes here coming from Russia, basically amusing, and they have no sense.
Yes, and Professor, going back to this news, what is the European Commission's stance on the legal as well as ethical implication of if they were to use frozen Russian assets to aid Ukraine?
Well, obviously the assets will be used to aid Ukraine. There's absolutely no problem, legal or ethical or whatsoever. Once the war is over, there will be a conference, peace conference, and there will be a kind of a peace treaty. I guess it will be signed by a new president in the Russian Federation. Putin will be gone by that time, and the next Russian leader will accept the capitulation and basically would agree those assets to be used to the restoration of Ukraine. Ukraine is the victim here, very clear, black and white. There is no argument against that, that all the Russian frozen assets should be used to restore the economy, the individual losses, and everything that Russia did in Ukraine over the last 3.5 years.
Thank you very much, Professor Popovsky, for joining us and sharing that insight. Now we move on to North America. Texas Army National Guard troops have been seen at a U.S. Army Reserve Training Center in Elwood, Illinois, about 50 miles southwest of Chicago, where President Donald Trump has said that they will be deployed. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem has arrived in Portland on Tuesday, visiting the local ICE facility as a federal lawsuit over the National Guard deployment continues to loom. On Monday, President Donald Trump has claimed without evidence that an insurrection is taking place in Portland, citing surging crime as he pushes to deploy Guard troops to the city. Speaking earlier from the Oval Office, Trump has said that he may invoke the Insurrection Act of 1792, which allows troops to engage in civilian law enforcement. Protester Nefradar Shade has said that he wants U.S. to get violent because he wants to enact martial law and mess with our elections. Another protester has added that he's declaring essentially a war zone in the streets of Portland.
It's dangerous because, like I said, you're taking away the few avenues we had to peacefully fight back. And he wants us to get violent because he wants to enact martial law, and he wants to mess with our elections. Our midterms are, a year away, which is too far for me to be comfortable. And they're going to try and do everything they can to hold on.
Now for this discussion, we are joined by Dr. Satoru Nagao. He's a fellow at Hudson Institute, joins us live from Tokyo. Thank you very much, Doctor, for joining us again. Good to see you. Now, looking back at this, U.S. has a lot going on, including this news. What are the legal and constitutional implications if President was to potentially invocation of the Insurrection Act of 1792 to deploy these National Guard troops?
Legal or not, it's maybe it rely on the decision of the court, but at the same time, this is not the main point, I believe. Main point is mutual trust between left and right in the United States. Because this Chicago area is, of course, led by the Democrats, and so left side. But President Trump is right side, and there is no trust between two. So, and the policy is completely different in case of the illegal immigration or other policy also. So that's why the, President Trump's side does not trust government governing the policy of the Democrats in this area. So that's why from the Texas, they sent troops to support the local police in the Chicago. That has happened. But at the same time, the troops from Texas are not expert of the law and order situation in Chicago. So that's why, indeed, the reality is, of course, they try to improve the law and order situation. But in this case, they need to cooperate with the local police. So that's why one thing, the politics is politics, and left versus right has happened. But another thing is in the law and order situation, police and troops cooperate each other, I think. And so maybe two different issues is ongoing. That is the reality, I think.
And how does this federal lawsuit over the National Guard deployment reflect broader concerns about the role of military forces in domestic policing?
Judiciary system demands a certain time to decide. So that's why even if the court is checking this decision, still there is a space politics shows more influence than the judicial system. So that's why in this case, if the President Trump decides, anyway, the troops, National Guard troops, will move from Texas to Illinois and start to work to support the local police to maintain law and order in this situation. And even if the Chicago local government oppose this issue, and in the court they asked this is illegal, unconstitutional, or something like that, they said, even if under such kind of situation, during the judicial system are checking it is unconstitutional or not, National Guard troops have already started work and try to maintain or improve the law and order situation in Illinois.
And how do you think, how will all this impact on future federal-state relations?
If this decision will improve the law and order situation, there is no problem. But at the same time, problem is the rift between left and right in the United States, I think, because mutual trust hasn't improved. So deteriorating relation between left and right in the United States is my current trend. So that's why in the near future, the more rift widen, of course, they cannot agree on anything that could happen. So even if their opinion is different in the democratic process, in the near future, they need to find something solution to mend this rift, I think.
And given President Trump's unverified claims of insurrection in Portland, how do you think, how does the surge of National Guard deployments affect public trust in law enforcement? And also, does this change anything? Does it make the state safer in long term?
Of course, the number of the troops is affecting the law and order situation anyway. So increasing the number of the policemen or the troops, of course, it will improve the law and order situation generally. So that's why this is not bad for view from the law and order. But so this could be the bad in the politics, but this could be the good for the law and order anyway.
Thank you very much, Dr. Satoru Nagao, for always joining us and sharing that insight. Now we move on and we stay in North America. Mexico is in talks with the United States to avoid a 25% tariff on medium and heavy-duty trucks set to take effect on November 1st. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has confirmed that her economy minister Marcelo Ebrard is engaged in discussions with Washington, and that she plans to request a phone call with U.S. President Donald Trump to seek an agreement before the levy is implemented. Let's listen into what she has said during a recent conference.
Es a todo el mundo. El arancel de los vehículos pesados no es para México. Obviamente a México le afecta más, porque tenemos exportación de vehículos pesados y vamos a buscar un acuerdo antes del 1 de noviembre. Estamos buscando eso. Si es necesario, pues igual una llamada personal con el presidente Trump. Por lo pronto,
Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump has announced on Monday that the 25% tariff will apply to all imported medium and heavy-duty trucks, citing national security concerns under a Section 232 investigation. Earlier on September 25th, Trump had initially announced the same 25% tariff on heavy trucks made outside the United States, but the implementation was delayed following pushback from U.S. automakers worried about supply chains and costs. Mexico is the largest supplier of heavy vehicles to the U.S., exporting nearly 95% of its production under the existing free trade agreement with Canada. Recent data reports show that from January to August, Mexico's exports of heavy vehicles to the U.S. dropped by almost 26% compared to last year. The measure comes amid a series of trade pressures that have already affected supply chains and costs for U.S. manufacturers, including previous tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper. Now, for this discussion, we're joined by Dr. Jayant Menon. He's a senior fellow at ISES, and Yusof Ishak Institute joins us live from Singapore. Thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World. Now, given this urgency of the situation, how likely is that President Sheinbaum's request for a phone call with President will result in any resolution?
Well, it's very difficult to tell with this administration what might happen. It could produce another delay, and we've already seen that happen a number of times with a lot of these tariffs. But I think, there's no way in which we can eventually avoid these tariffs. I mean, Trump seems quite adamant about pursuing this tariff policy of his, and I think he feels that this is a great way of not only raising revenue under the false presumption that it's paid by foreigners, but also I think he's hoping for a lot of relocation of investment from Mexico, but also elsewhere, to the U.S. to revive manufacturing and to return jobs as he sees it. But this, of course, confuses the way in which production is managed these days through supply chains, right? There's no such thing as a product being made in one country, especially not an elaborately transformed manufactured product like a heavy-duty truck. There's inputs from multiple countries, and there's a lot of value added from the U.S. So in a way, he's punishing U.S. consumers and U.S. jobs with these tariffs.
And Doctor, what can we say from these past, also looking at the history behind President Trump and Sheinbaum's dialogues? What are the key points of contention in the ongoing discussions between Mexico and the U.S. regarding these tariffs, and what possible compromises could both sides consider to avoid these tariffs?
I think the important point here is that there is already a trade agreement in place, the USMCA, which Trump himself negotiated and called the greatest trade agreement ever. So, that should be the fallback rather than any type of, personal relationship. Although I know that President Trump is keen on pursuing, diplomatic and trade policy on a personal level. But there are rules in place, and there's a trade agreement in place. And currently, the Canadian Prime Minister is in the U.S. as well, and they are also going to be affected by this. And so hopefully both these leaders, two of the U.S.'s strongest trade partners and allies, can bring some sense to this current state of affairs when it comes to the unnecessary tariffs on goods that are already supporting jobs and value addition in the U.S.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jayant Menon, for joining us and sharing your insight all the way from Singapore. Now we move on. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has accused individuals based in the United States of planning an attack on the U.S. Embassy in Caracas. Let's listen in to what he has said.
El día de ayer, lunes, a las 3 de la tarde, a través del embajador McNamara en Bogotá, el diputado Jorge Rodríguez, jefe de la Delegación de Paz de Venezuela, informó oficialmente al señor McNamara y al gobierno de Estados Unidos y por otras vías de comunicación los nombres, apellidos y ubicación en los Estados Unidos de las personas que prepararon ese atentado frustrado y fallido contra la sede de su embajada en Caracas. El gobierno de Estados Unidos, a través del Departamento de Estado y otras vías, tiene la información completa. Los terroristas que prepararon el frustrado y fallido ataque contra su embajada que se iba a dar entre el domingo en la noche o el lunes como un incidente para una escalada de violencia, están en los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica y tienen los nombres.
The Venezuelan leader had earlier warned of a so-called false flag operation allegedly orchestrated by extremist sectors of the local Venezuelan right aimed at planting explosives at the embassy. He also said that a European embassy had been alerted, though he did not specify which one. This is all we have time for. We will continue